"I'll ensure you're in that nursing home, one way or another," and gladly said my son. But he had no idea. Evelyn sat very still beneath the bright window where the city sunlight pooled like warm tea across the rug, and she listened to her son speak with the brisk, tidy cadence of someone who had rehearsed care as if it were a set of instructions rather than a promise. His voice carried the certainty of decisions made in spreadsheets, headings, bullet points, times and dates, the eloquence of logistical compassion. He said the sentence, the one that carried the weight of movement and a final address, with a smile that curdled slightly when he imagined the problem solved. And he did not see that the problem, from Evelyn's seat, had many faces. Evelyn's hands were folded inside a cardigan she had mended twice, and the small scar along her knuckle remembered a kitchen where she had baked bread for children, who were now grown and living their own crowded lives. She did not answer him then, because words would feed the wrong branch of the conversation. She instead measured the sounds of the room, the distant siren, the kettle's soft memory in the kitchen, the way light trimmed his jaw with an indifferent kindness. He left for the bedroom to gather the papers that would make his certainty formal contracts and printable verification from a facility whose brochures smelled of calm and cost-effective comfort. And the door clicked behind him. In that precise quiet, Evelyn stood and walked without hurry to the low table beneath the lamp and slid her fingers beneath a shoebox that lived under the fold of old magazines, a place he never opened because he never needed to look that deeply. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. The shoebox was light with paper but heavy with care, receipts for small inventions she had ordered decades ago, a thin ledger where she had recorded the cost of replacing a window, a folded map of a neighborhood now oddly familiar for reasons she would not explain. Most important, bound with a faded ribbon, was a slim packet of letters she had written to herself long ago. Small promises and lists she kept as anchor points through seasons of change. She had learned to keep her life in small containers, a recipe card for a cake that always rose, a thumbed index card with the numbers of neighbors who looked out for one another, a tiny key whose lock had been changed twice in a decade, but whose presence made her feel that things could still be closed and kept. As she replaced the shoebox, Evelyn knew that the son's plan was not just about convenience but about a rewriting of the story, one in which her days would be organized by others and her quiet habits catalogued. That rewriting could be gentle or it could be erasing. The difference mattered more than he thought. She set the shoebox back and walked to the kitchen, opening cupboards and closing them with the practiced movements of a woman who had always arranged her world to suit the small human comforts she prized. In the pantry she found a jar of strong tea leaves and an old tin of baking powder, and she smiled slightly at how the ordinary things of a life can stand in for defenses when the more formal ones have not yet been prepared. Evelyn had a plan that was built of simple legal facts and human levers, a durable power of attorney she had once considered a shield against rash choices, a list of neighbors who could attest to her capacity for daily living, and a small savings reserve meant for repairs rather than relocation. She also had a stubbornness that had been sharpened by years of rearranging rooms to suit grandchildren, and by nights spent listening to the radio when the world felt too large and unkind. If a social worker came with forms and polite concern, she could show the ramp she had installed, the handrail in the bathtub she had affixed herself with careful drilling, the lowered counter where she kept the teapot within reach, evidence that a life need not be moved to be made safe. Evelyn was patient about the fact that the son's heart might be in the right place. He feared a decline he had not seen clearly and wanted to protect what he loved by reshaping it. But protection without consent is a different thing. And Evelyn had lived long enough to insist that the shape of her days remained partly her own. She took a notepad and a pencil and began to write a list that mapped her defenses and allies, names, phone numbers, small repairs that could be done in an afternoon, a short bullet noting her preferred morning tea ritual as evidence of active habits. She wrote with the tidy economy of someone who knew the value of clear, legible proof. Then she made calls with a voice that did not tremble. Rosa, who lived 2 floors below and had an impossibly bright laugh, agreed to come for tea and to bring an emergency contact sheet. Marcus from around the corner, who had once saved Evelyn's cat from a balcony, promised to stop by and check the step at the entrance. A woman from the community center who ran the knitting circle someone Evelyn had coached years ago offered to accompany Evelyn to any assessment and to bear witness to her daily competence. These small alliances were not theatrical. They were the living proof of a neighborhood stitched together by habit and mutual observation. Evelyn set a time for Rosa to arrive, and she hung the kettle on the hob to preheat. Coffee would have been too heavy for the afternoon, but tea suggested a continuity she valued. the ritual of pouring and watching the color deepen in the cup. She positioned a chair opposite the window so that if the caseworkers came, they would see the routine of moving, a person who read, who cooked, who greeted others in the hallway with a practiced warmth. She laid out a folder on the table, the one with her own documentation, a concise medical history, notes on her daily habits, letters from neighbors, and the small ledger that proved her autonomy. It was a modest folder, but it represented decades of living and the particular knowledge of someone who had kept up life from unraveling by means both ordinary and quietly clever. When the son carrying the printed pages from the facility, Evelyn greeted him with a slow kindness that made him falter because he had expected either defiance or immediate compliance. He placed the brochure on the table and tapped the glossy page with a fingertip as if to punctuate the argument. Programs, meals, safety measures, social hours. She listened and then asked a single, practical question about visiting hours, not because she doubted the kindness in the programs but because she knew that visiting hours shape emotional life in ways families rarely notice until the hours have hardened into routine. He answered with impatience that softened when he saw the calm in her face. He assumed that was retreat, but it was instead reconnoitering Evelyn's slow, careful inventory of what would and would not be sacrificed. Outside, clouds gathered and the light cooled. The son's voice softened as he leaned forward and suggested dates and logistics. She accepted the fact of his concern and the evidence of his fear. But she also set a boundary that was as deliberate as it was gentle. Before any decision, there would be an in-home assessment with witnesses she trusted, and there would be a period in which alternatives were considered. He looked at her with a new uncertainty, and that unsettled him more than any argument would have. The tidy plan he had prepared began to look less inevitable. Evelyn's mind was a ledger of moments. The night she had navigated a storm to carry a neighbor's baby to safety, the time she had peddled a small sewing machine for a school class, the many afternoons she had sat knitting and given advice about the particular stubbornness of teenagers and the precise temperature at which bread rises. These were not heroic acts by grand standards, but they were the scaffolding of a life that taught her how to repair small disasters and to negotiate with systems that intended efficiency over nuance. She spoke not of those nights as trophies but as evidence that living skillfully mattered. The son, who loved her in a practical, sometimes hurried way, began to see that the question was not whether she needed supervision, but whether supervision should be the default response to discomfort. Evelyn's proposal, which she presented with the first clear notes of insistence, asked for a trial of household modifications and community support prior to any transfer. She suggested that an occupational therapist assess her apartment, and that a brief schedule of visiting aides be tested before the idea of a permanent move was considered small, reversible steps that respected both safety and agency. Her tone made the request seem reasonable, and in the pause that followed, it seemed for a moment that the son might assent to the compromise. There was a break in the conversation when the intercom buzzed, and then a knock. Rosa had arrived with her lemon cake wrapped in wax paper, and the bright sound of her entrance shifted the room's mood. Rosa greeted both of them, hugged Evelyn as if to reassure and to acknowledge, and then casually asked to see the apartment while she placed the cake on the table. She moved through the rooms with tender curiosity, commenting on the handrail in the bathroom and the little ramp by the threshold, noting small fixes with a practical delight that made the son listen in a way he had not earlier. Marcus arrived shortly after and inspected the step with the kind of competence that comes from a lifetime of small mechanical kindnesses. He pronounced the entrance safe with the modest authority of someone who sees the world as repairable and already set ideas thus into motion. The son, witnessing the network of neighbors and their competent evidence of care, felt the force of a communal testimony that reframed the problem he had set out to solve alone. Evelyn watched him through the window's late light and felt a tenderness toward the worry in his face, the same way one might feel for a weathered tree leaning toward storm. She had no desire to humiliate him, she only wanted to hold the shape of her days in her own hands for a while longer. That evening, with the cake tasted and the papers still on the table, the son sat back and inhaled as if the day's decisions required oxygen that comfort could provide, and he asked a softer question about timing, about whether a delay would be hurtful or helpful. Evelyn answered with the clarity that comes from someone who has watched the slow craft of a life and knows what it costs to move its foundations without good reason. She wanted time and proof, time for the in-home assessment, and proof that relocation was the only viable option. She promised cooperation if the assessment concluded clearly that she could not remain, and she promised to consider options if the evidence pointed against independence. It was not a refusal so much as a request for fairness. And when the son realized that the demand did not mean rejection of his concern but a structured negotiation of it, he exhaled and nodded, not completely at peace, but relieved of the pressure to act immediately. As the night closed, Evelyn prepared tea and placed 2 cups on the table. The ritual of pouring and handing one to her son felt to her like the first small treaty of the day. A human agreement made at the level of ordinary things. In that simple exchange there was room for both care and autonomy, and when she lifted her cup, she thought of the months ahead with a resolute warmth, ready to steward whatever came with equal measures of dignity and cunning. Evelyn woke to the low hum of morning traffic bleeding through the window, a faint pulse that reminded her that the city itself never surrendered to silence, only changed its rhythm. She lay still for a while, her eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling where paint had surrendered to time, each line like a map of what she had kept standing. The kettle clicked faintly in the kitchen where she had set it to preheat before bed. Its warmth was part of her morning logic, a promise of continuity. She rose slowly, steady but cautious, aware of the tiny betrayals of balance that came with age but refusing to grant them dominion. She dressed deliberately, each motion a quiet declaration that her body was still a vessel of intention. The phone blinked once, a message from Rosa confirming the appointment with the home assessment officer, and Evelyn felt both relief and dread. It was better to have the conversation than to be cornered by it later, but she understood how these evaluations often came with invisible scripts, how certain questions were meant not to seek truth but to steer outcomes. She moved to the kitchen table and arranged her notes again, aligning the pages so their edges met perfectly, a small symmetry that gave her comfort. The apartment itself felt different that morning, as if it were aware that its worth would be measured in categories of accessibility and compliance rather than memory. The living room, with its warm brown curtains and framed photographs of birthdays and seaside days, would appear cluttered to an inspector. Evelyn considered which items to move. She decided to leave them. To clear them would be to concede that her life had to be sanitized to remain credible. Instead, she dusted gently, straightened the cushion where her grandson had once spilled cocoa, and smiled faintly at the stubborn stain that still marked the fabric like an autograph of joy. The air held the smell of tea and lemon cake, Rosa's gift from yesterday, and for a moment the thought of sharing it with the inspector seemed almost mischievous. She brewed 2 cups, anticipating the ritual as a disarming tactic. Hospitality was a shield the bureaucratic mind never quite knew how to refuse. She placed the cups on coasters shaped like leaves and waited for the knock, heart measured but steady, her palms flat on the table as if bracing for a storm that might yet pass gently. The inspector arrived, not alone but with a young assistant who carried a digital clipboard and wore the polite tension of someone learning to read lives as data. Evelyn's smile widened in the doorway, softening the air before words could harden it. Rosa sat in the corner, knitting, as if her presence were incidental, though her eyes tracked every movement. The inspector introduced herself as Ms. Grant and explained the purpose of the visit with rehearsed clarity, her tone both apologetic and firm. Evelyn listened, nodding. Offering tea before the formalities began, Ms. Grant hesitated, but accepted, and that acceptance marked the first quiet victory of the day. The assistant took notes about square footage, lighting, mobility aids, temperature control, and emergency contact visibility. Evelyn guided them gently through each room, narrating her routines in a voice that blended precision with warmth. How she managed stairs, how she cooked without leaving the stove unattended, how she kept medications sorted by color and time of day. It was both demonstration and defense. The choreography of someone who understood the politics of independence. At the bathroom doorway, the assistant asked about fall risk, his tone almost kind but edged with procedural inevitability. Evelyn pointed to the textured mats she had installed, the extra rail, the height-adjusted seat she had ordered online. Ms. Grant inspected each with quiet approval, noting compliance codes. Then came the harder question: how often family visited, and whether Evelyn felt isolated. Evelyn paused, sensing the invisible weight behind the words, the subtle framing that could make solitude sound like neglect. She answered carefully. Her community was near, her days structured, her mind engaged. Rosa chimed in, describing their shared walks, the book club meetings, the weekly market trips. The inspector nodded, writing faster, and Evelyn felt the balance of the conversation tilt slightly toward her side. The assistant asked to test the emergency call button installed near the bed. Evelyn pressed it, the soft beep filling the room like a heartbeat, reliable and When it stopped, silence returned, thicker, but not hostile. The inspection lasted an hour, and by the end, Ms. Grant's tone had softened from evaluation to conversation. Before leaving, Ms. Grant admitted she found the home well-maintained and thoughtfully adapted. She mentioned that a report would still be filed, but from her view, relocation seemed unnecessary if current supports remained consistent. Evelyn thanked her with sincere calm, offering a slice of lemon cake that made the inspector laugh and decline politely. When the door closed, Rosa exhaled, setting her knitting down with a decisive motion. "You won that one?" she said softly, and Evelyn smiled. Though her eyes carried the fatigue of a battle fought through politeness, the victory, she knew, was provisional. Paperwork could be interpreted differently once removed from the warmth of this apartment, but she had placed her evidence, her habits, her proof of life into the system's language, and that mattered. She wrote down Ms. Grant's card number, the assistant's name, and the visit's time, because details were a form of armor. Later that day, her son called, his voice uncertain. He had expected resistance, maybe anger, but not bureaucratic efficiency. "So they came," he said, and she could hear the calculation behind his words, the slow rearranging of his plan. Evelyn described the visit in measured detail, emphasizing that the inspector saw no need for immediate relocation. There was a pause, long enough to contain pride and irritation in equal parts. He asked if she had manipulated the process, his tone half teasing, half suspicious. "I simply showed them my life as it is," she said, "and they saw it clearly." He sighed, admitting that perhaps he had rushed the decision. That maybe his fear of losing her had disguised itself as efficiency. Evelyn let him talk, her silence guiding him toward honesty. He confessed he had been overwhelmed by balancing his own family, his work, and the looming sense that something would break if he didn't act. She told him gently that care born of panic rarely lands where intended. There was quiet understanding then, and for the first time in months, their conversation felt like partnership instead of custody. In the days that followed, Evelyn's home became subtly busier. Marcus dropped by to fix the step he had inspected earlier, installing a new strip of non-slip rubber that looked professional enough to impress any future visitor. Rosa organized a small rota of neighbors who checked in not as wardens but as friends, sharing tea, errands, or laughter. The apartment's rhythm deepened. Its walls seemed to hum with affirmation. Evelyn found herself rediscovering small pleasures she had nearly forgotten: writing letters in careful ink, folding laundry while humming old songs, watering the plants that had learned her patience. The city outside continued indifferent, but her little corner of it felt newly fortified by human will. Yet beneath this calm, she sensed the larger truth, that systems built to care often reshaped the care for, that independence could only survive if defended with intelligence as much as affection. She was not naive. She knew this would not be the last time the question of relocation surfaced. But next time, the foundation of her defense would be stronger, documented, and communal. One evening, as dusk pressed pink against the windows, she sat at her desk and opened her old ledger again. She added a new section titled Continuity Plan. Beneath it, she listed the contacts of neighbors, the assessment details, copies of her medical instructions, and a note for her son. "If decisions must be made again, begin here. This is the record of my choices." She sealed the page in a clear sleeve, not to hide it but to preserve it against revision. Then she called her grandson, who was away at university, and told him stories about when his father was young, the mischievous kind that disarmed generations. He laughed, asked about the apartment, and promised to visit soon. After hanging up, Evelyn sat for a while in the growing dark, the city's hum blending with her quiet satisfaction. The world still asked her to justify her existence in bureaucratic language, but she could meet it on its own terms without surrendering her narrative. The next week, Ms. Grant called unexpectedly. She explained that her supervisor wanted a follow-up visit to verify long-term suitability. Evelyn agreed calmly, arranging a date. After hanging up, she felt the twinge of fatigue but also an odd pride. Persistence, she knew, was not always loud. Sometimes it was simply the refusal to be worn down by repetition. She tidied the living room again, not for inspection but for herself, arranging the light to fall evenly across the photographs. She caught her reflection in the glass of one framed-in image of a younger woman holding a toddler, both laughing, and she thought of the strange symmetry of time, how she now fought for the right to remain herself in the same way she had once fought for that child to have his independence. Humanity, she mused, always built its dignity in cycles of permission and defiance. She whispered quietly thanks to the empty room for being the witness of her stubborn grace. 2 mornings later, she woke to find a letter slid under her door, a notice from the facility her son had contacted, confirming a reservation had been tentatively held for her. The paper smelled faintly of printer ink and inevitability. She sat down and read it twice, tracing the words with her finger. Her son had not yet mentioned it, perhaps hoping the transition would seem gradual, consensual. Evelyn folded the letter and placed it beneath her ledger, not as denial but as a document of continuity. Then she wrote him a note. Come for dinner tonight, bring no papers, only your appetite. When he arrived, the smell of roasting vegetables filled the apartment, and the table was set for two. The meal was simple, but every detail, the folded napkins, the softened lamp, the faint classical record playing, was deliberate. During dinner, she asked about his work, about his children, about the way the city had changed. Only after dessert did she place the reservation letter on the table. His eyes widened, guilty and defensive in the same instant. I didn't mean to, he began, but she raised a hand. I know, she said softly. You meant to help, but help must listen. He bowed his head, ashamed and grateful all at once. The conversation that followed stretched deep into the night, slow and painful but necessary, like surgery done without anesthesia but with trust. By the time he left, the reservation had been cancelled by mutual agreement. A phone call made together under Evelyn's supervision. The facility clerk on the other end sounded surprised but not offended. Such reversals, she said, happened more often than families admitted. When the call ended, Evelyn's son hugged her tightly, a rare gesture that carried both apology and admiration. She accepted it, her eyes damp but bright. You always were clever, he murmured, and she smiled. I had to be, she replied. The world doesn't make it easy for women who refuse to vanish. He left with a lighter step, and Evelyn sat again by the window, watching the city's nightlights flicker like stubborn stars. She felt the quiet satisfaction of having not only defended her space but educated love itself on the difference between protection and erasure. When she finally went to bed, she placed her notes on the bedside table, not out of paranoia but pride. They were the record of a battle fought not with anger but with reason, community, and a little humor. She thought of Rosa, Marcus, Ms. Grant, and even her son, all part of the same human web where care could so easily twist into control if not tempered by listening. Her last thought before sleep was of morning tea, and how she would pour it tomorrow in the same measured way. The same small ceremony of existence that no form or facility could replicate. The city breathed beyond the window, and Evelyn, beneath her warm quilt, breathed with it, steady, undefeated, quietly triumphant. Evelyn's world, after that night, seemed to hum differently, not quieter, but tuned to a deeper note of balance she had not felt in years. She woke to the sound of pigeons tapping against the window and thought of it as applause from the city itself. The days flowed with renewed order. Tea in the morning, letters written in the mid-afternoon, and evening walks with Rosa down the block, where the street lamps bloomed like polite suns. Yet beneath the pattern of ordinary hours, something new began to gather, a pressure, not from her son or the bureaucracy, but from the wider machinery of care. The follow-up visit that Ms. Grant had mentioned was scheduled for the following week, yet this one came with a new detail. It would not only assess her home, but also record a psychological evaluation meant to determine her future capacity for independent living. Evelyn recognized the phrase immediately, was the bureaucratic synonym for permission to override her autonomy later. She had seen enough paperwork in her time volunteering at the community center to know how phrasing shaped fate. A single ticked box could transform freedom into supervision. So she prepared, quietly and thoroughly. In the same way a gardener prepares soil for uncertain weather. Her preparations were not frantic but methodical. She gathered every piece of evidence that proved her presence in the world was active, not passive. She collected letters from Rosa and Marcus, each written with affection but structured like affidavits. She recorded her routines in a journal, complete with times, meals, exercises, and social visits. It was not performance. It was documentation of life as it actually unfolded, of a mind that still mapped and remembered. She called the community health office to ask about her rights under the Senior Independence Clause, a call that startled the clerk, who was not accustomed to elderly callers quoting policy numbers. Evelyn's voice carried the gentle authority of someone who had once raised a household through economic storms and political changes. Bureaucracy, she knew, was only intimidating to those who entered it unprepared. She printed the relevant clauses and underlined phrases that would matter if anyone tried to classify her otherwise. When Rosa arrived that evening, Evelyn laid the papers out on the table as if setting a chessboard. Rosa laughed softly and said, "You've turned this into strategy." Evelyn smiled. "I've simply learned the game's language." The day of the follow-up visit dawned bright and windless, the kind of day that makes everything seem freshly ironed. Evelyn had baked scones early in the morning. The smell filled the apartment with a warmth that disguised anxiety. When the knock came, it was not Ms. Grant but a new figure, a man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a laptop under his arm. He introduced himself as Dr. Latham, the psychologist assigned to perform the assessment. His handshake was firm but distracted. His attention seemed to live partly inside the device he carried. Rosa was there again, her knitting basket strategically placed near the sofa as if she were merely keeping company. The doctor began politely, his questions framed in clinical neutrality. He asked about sleep patterns, memory recall, finances, emotional well-being. Evelyn answered each with steady precision, sometimes weaving in humor that made Rosa stifle a laugh. When he asked her to recall a sequence of numbers, she recited them backward just to show the boundaries of the test. He smiled briefly, impressed but guarded, then shifted to more probing ground, what she feared most about aging, whether she sometimes forgot words whether she had ever found herself disoriented in familiar places. Evelyn answered honestly, acknowledging small lapses but balancing each with evidence of adaptation. Notes on the fridge, labeled drawers, routines that anchored her days. Halfway through, the conversation grew more personal. Dr. Latham asked about her family dynamics, particularly her son. Evelyn's hands folded tightly for a moment before she relaxed them. She spoke with careful affection, describing him as dutiful, sometimes too efficient in his love. The doctor nodded, typing, and Evelyn imagined the words taking shape in a report that would later be interpreted by someone who had never met her. "Do you feel your son respects your wishes?" he asked finally. Evelyn paused, feeling the weight of both truth and consequence. "He tries," she said, "but trying and understanding are different acts." The doctor looked up at her then, his eyes less analytic for a moment. "That's well said," he murmured. She smiled faintly. "I've had practice in explaining things that matter." The assessment ended after an hour. Dr. Latham closed his laptop and said softly, "You seem very capable, Mrs. Harrow. I wish all my assessments went this smoothly." She thanked him and offered a scone, which he accepted with a small laugh. As he left, Evelyn noted how his expression had changed, professional, but touched by the quiet revelation of competence that defied his expectations. After the door closed, Rosa leaned forward. "You handled him like a diplomat." Evelyn chuckled. "Diplomacy is just patience with better posture." Still, exhaustion rolled over her like slow fog. She sat, letting the hum of the refrigerator and the rustle of curtains steady her. Later that afternoon, she wrote in her journal, "Assessment completed. They saw me clearly today, but clarity fades in reports." It was her reminder that perception and documentation were not the same. That human understanding often dissolved when translated into bureaucratic language. She resolved to follow up directly. The next morning, she dressed neatly and took a taxi to the district care office, where she requested a copy of her own report. The clerk, surprised, hesitated, then handed her a form to sign. "It'll take a few days," he said. Evelyn thanked him and left, her step slow but steady. She knew that waiting could be as strategic as action. When the report arrived by post, its tone was more favorable than she had dared to hope. Dr. Latham's conclusions highlighted her strong cognitive awareness, stable mood, and effective support network. There was a cautious note recommending periodic review, but nothing suggesting mandatory relocation. Evelyn read it twice, smiling at how official language could, for once, serve truth. She mailed a copy to her son with a brief note. Results enclosed. No further facility plans needed at this time. Love, Mother. That evening he called again, his voice lighter, almost sheepish. "You've outmaneuvered me," he said. Evelyn laughed softly. "I wasn't competing, dear, just living properly." They spoke for an hour, and in that time, something subtle mended between them, the tight weave of care and control, loosening into genuine dialogue. Weeks turned into a rhythm of quiet victories. Evelyn volunteered once more at the community center, helping other seniors navigate paperwork and online forms. Word spread that she had handled the system better than most, and neighbors began asking her advice. She organized small sessions where she taught others how to document independence, how to photograph their homes, record routines, and request transparency from agencies. The sessions became gatherings of resilience, and laughter filled the hallways that had once echoed only with bureaucratic dread. Rosa teased her, calling her the General, and Evelyn accepted the title with mock solemnity. Beneath the humor, though, she felt something stirring, unawareness that what had begun as self-defense was becoming a movement of quiet defiance. Humanity, she thought, thrived best when it shared its tools. One afternoon, while sorting papers, she received a letter from Ms. Grant herself. The inspector thanked Evelyn for her cooperation and mentioned that her case had been used in training to illustrate best practices for autonomy preservation. Evelyn reread the line with disbelief, then joy. It was the closest thing to vindication she could have imagined. Not only had she kept her home, but her insistence on dignity had reshaped a small corner of the system that once threatened her. She framed the letter and placed it near the kitchen clock. Every time she passed, it reminded her that persistence, when done with kindness, could ripple beyond one household, but peace, she knew, never lingered unchallenged. One evening, as she prepared soup, the television broadcast a segment about a proposed city ordinance to consolidate senior care under new guidelines, ones that would give the government expanded rights to relocate elders deemed inefficiently housed. The phrase chilled her. Efficiency had never been a virtue she trusted when applied to people. Rosa called moments later, equally alarmed, and the two agreed to attend the upcoming community meeting on the matter. Evelyn felt the old spark of resistance ignite again, sharper than fear. She gathered her notes, updated her ledger, and began drafting remarks that were precise, factual, but edged with human truth. This, she realized, was no longer just about her home, it was about the principle she had embodied through stubborn decency. The meeting was held in a crowded hall that smelled faintly of disinfectant and nervous coffee. Dozens of residents sat folding programs in their laps, faces tight with worry. Officials from the department stood behind a long table, speaking of resource optimization and care integration. Evelyn listened quietly until the question period opened. Then she rose, steady but commanding, her cardigan neat, her eyes bright. The microphone trembled slightly in her hand, but her voice did not. "You speak of efficiency," she said, "as if care were a math problem. But we are not variables to be solved. We are citizens who have built this city, and we know how to live in it." The room stilled. Even the officials paused. She continued, weaving policy language with lived reality, pointing out how community-based support cost less and preserved dignity better than forced relocation. Her logic was unassailable, but it was her tone, calm, human, unembittered, that carried the room. Applause broke out when she finished. Rosa beamed from the front row, and even a few of the officials clapped politely, perhaps realizing they had underestimated the woman whose file once read at risk of dependency. After the meeting, a journalist approached for a brief interview, and the next morning, Evelyn's photograph appeared in the local paper with the headline, "Resident Challenges Policy with Grace and Facts." Her son called immediately, half amused, half astonished. "Mother, you've become a public figure." She laughed. "I'm just being inconvenient in a useful way." The days that followed brought visitors, neighbors, community workers, even Ms. Grant again. Now as a friend rather than inspector. They all said the same thing in different words, that Evelyn had reminded them what humanity looked like when it refused to shrink under paperwork. For Evelyn, it was never about rebellion for its own sake. It was about reclaiming the narrative that care should not erase identity. As spring settled in, the apartment bloomed with light and visits. Children from the building came by to help her water plants. Marcus fixed a new shelf. Rosa organized an independence fair at the community hall. Evelyn watched it all with a mixture of pride and humility. She had not planned to lead anything, yet somehow her simple defense of home had become a seed for others to plant. One evening, while writing in her journal, she reflected, perhaps the measure of a life is not in what we keep, but in what we teach others to protect. She closed the book and smiled, knowing there was still more to face the policy battle. The years ahead, but that she had allies now, not just friends. Her son visited more often, not to check on her but to listen, bringing his children who filled the apartment with bright noise. As she tucked her youngest grandchild into her lap one evening, he asked why people kept thanking her downstairs. Evelyn chuckled and said, "Because I told the truth, loudly enough to sound like music." That night, long after everyone had gone, she stood at the window and watched the city breathe under its lattice of lights. She thought of the line her son had once said, the cruel certainty of it, and how it had set this long, unexpected journey in motion. "I'll ensure you're in that nursing home, one way or another," he had declared. She smiled now at the irony. In his own way, he had ensured her independence instead, by provoking the resistance that reminded her who she was. Outside, a soft wind moved through the street trees, carrying faint laughter from distant balconies. Evelyn whispered quietly, "You had no idea, my dear boy, what I still had left to teach." Then she turned off the light, the city glowing around her like an open book, and the night settled gently, unthreatened, utterly her own. The summer arrived early that year, flooding Evelyn's apartment with golden heat that lingered on the curtains and across the hardwood floor like a patient visitor. The city outside seemed to shimmer with both fatigue and anticipation. Children released from school, trains rattling with restless crowds, the air humming with conversations that mixed joy with complaint. For Evelyn, the warmth was both a gift and a challenge. Her bones ached more, but her garden boxes on the balcony exploded into life. Basil and marigold and shy tomatoes pressing their green urgency toward the sun. Each morning she watered them with a slow grace, her fingers damp and fragrant. The simple act feeling like an affirmation that she was still a caretaker in every sense. The newspaper article about her speech had drawn attention far beyond her building. Letters began arriving from strangers who thanked her for speaking on behalf of their parents, their neighbors, themselves. She kept them in a neat stack under a vase of daisies, rereading them when doubts crept in at night. The letters did not inflate her pride, they steadied it. They reminded her that resistance, when kind and articulate, could echo wider than anger. Her son visited more often now, not out of guilt but genuine connection. They shared dinners filled with laughter and old stories, rediscovering rhythms lost 2 years of strained communication. One evening, he brought a small tablet device, configured with large text and voice notes. "So you can read those letters comfortably," he said, setting it gently on the table. Evelyn eyed it warily, suspicious of new machines, but curiosity softened her. Together they explored it, pictures of her grandchildren, emails, articles, even a video call function. The device became an unexpected bridge between generations, one that let her speak with distant friends and see faces she had missed for years. Yet technology, like all gifts, carried shadows. Within a week, notifications began to appear for programs she hadn't signed up for. Care networks, health monitoring offers, automated home assessments disguised as safety upgrades. She frowned at the persistence of it, realizing that even convenience came with an appetite for oversight. "Everything has eyes these days," she muttered. Her son laughed it off. But Evelyn saw something sharper in the trend, the quiet shift from voluntary to expected surveillance. Humanity's inventions, she thought, too easily forgot the soul of their users. By midsummer, the proposed senior ordinance had reached a decisive stage. The city council would soon vote on whether to centralize oversight of elderly care facilities and home residencies. Evelyn, Rosa, and a growing coalition of neighbors had organized a campaign under a modest name, the Living Choice Network. They met weekly at the community hall, a bright space filled with folding chairs, fans that hummed unevenly, and stacks of petitions. Evelyn's leadership was unspoken, yet absolute. She guided discussions, balanced tempers, and drafted letters to local representatives. Her calm authority drew both respect and affection. Younger volunteers often watched her in quiet admiration, noting how she used diplomacy like art. She never shouted, she persuaded. She never shamed, she invited reflection. Her words reminded them that the fight for autonomy was not rebellion, it was stewardship of dignity. When local media began covering their efforts, Evelyn insisted the focus remain collective. "No heroes," she told the reporters. "Just humans remembering how to care properly." The day of the public hearing arrived heavy with heat. Evelyn, dressed in a soft linen dress, pinned a small brooch shaped like an oak leaf to her collar, and carried her folder of notes. Her son offered to drive her, but she declined. Marcus would accompany her instead, his van fitted with a cooler of water and the air conditioner rattling cheerfully. The city hall loomed ahead, its stone steps worn smooth by generations of footsteps, and Evelyn climbed them slowly but without pause. Inside, the chamber buzzed with voices, advocates, officials, reporters. The hearing began with formal statements from policymakers, their speeches full of numbers, efficiency projections, and well-meaning abstractions. Evelyn listened with polite stillness, her fingers folded on her lap. When her name was called for public comment, she rose and approached the microphone. Her opening words were simple. "I'm not here as a statistic." The sentence hushed the room. She spoke for 7 minutes, weaving data with lived truth, describing how policy looked when it entered a kitchen or a quiet morning routine. She told them how the language of care could become a cage if it forgot that independence, too, was a form of health. Her voice carried the clarity of weathered wisdom, the rhythm of someone who had balanced hope and lost long enough to know their difference. When she finished, the applause rose not like thunder but like sunrise, inevitable, filling every corner of the chamber. Afterward, journalists swarmed, officials whispered, and council members exchanged unreadable glances. Evelyn felt both exhilarated and drained. Rosa handed her water, and Marcus guided her toward a bench near the lobby where the light poured through tall windows. You were magnificent, Rosa said, squeezing her hand. Evelyn smiled faintly. I was necessary, she replied. The vote would not happen that day. Deliberations would continue for weeks. But something had shifted. The conversation, once sterile, now carried the tone of accountability. Humanity had entered the paperwork again. As evening fell, Evelyn returned home to find her son waiting outside her building with takeout boxes and an uncertain grin. You made the news again, he said. They ate on the balcony while cicadas murmured in the dark. He told her he had shown the video of her speech to his children. They're proud of you, he said softly. Evelyn looked at the sky, streaked with lavender, and whispered, then it was worth it. Weeks passed, and the city council finally voted. The ordinance was amended, reshaped by the public response. It still aimed for efficiency but required consent, documentation, and review by local community boards before any relocation. It was not perfect, but it was humane. The Living Choice Network celebrated with a small gathering at the community hall. Paper cups of lemonade clinked, laughter filled the room, and Rosa surprised everyone by presenting Evelyn with a small plaque that read, "For speaking when silence was easier." Evelyn accepted it with tears she did not hide. I only wanted to stay home, she said softly, and look what we built instead. They toasted with lemonade, the sweetness, light and sharp. For once, victory did not feel like defiance, it felt like completion. Still, time pressed onward with its quiet insistence. The summer's glow began to thin. Autumn crept into the leaves. Evelyn noticed her strength waning in small ways. Stairs felt steeper, nights longer, memory edges softer. She acknowledged it without fear, understanding that change, too, was part of dignity. One afternoon, she sat with her son in the living room, going through old albums. They laughed at the fashions, the smiles, the earnestness of earlier decades. Then, in a rare moment of gravity, she took his hand. Promise me, she said, that when the day comes, I truly need help. You'll ask me how I want it before you decide what it looks like. His eyes glistened. I promise, he said quietly. And I'll listen this time. It was not just forgiveness exchanged in that moment. It was renewal. They had both learned that love, without dialogue, could turn dangerous even when born of care. As the leaves turned gold, Evelyn began to spend more time writing. She filled her journal with reflections, stories, fragments of lessons she hoped her grandchildren might one day read. Each entry was a conversation with time, a way to pass down the blueprint of humanity's softer strength, the courage to question systems without hate, to defend oneself without cruelty. She wrote of the kindness that had held her, Rosa's laughter, Marcus's practical wisdom, Ms. Grant's fair-mindedness, her son's growth. She ended each page with the same line, independence is not the absence of care, but the freedom to choose its shape. One crisp morning, a letter arrived from the mayor's office inviting her to join a new advisory panel on senior autonomy. Evelyn laughed aloud when she read it, startling a pigeon from the balcony rail. The irony delighted her. Once nearly relocated as an inconvenience, she was now being asked to shape city policy. She accepted, of course, not for recognition but because she saw the pattern of life's strange symmetry. At her first meeting, seated beside officials half her age, she spoke not as a reformer but as a witness. Her insights shaped a proposal for mentorship programs pairing capable elders with isolated peers. Ensuring independence became a shared endeavor rather than a solitary struggle. The proposal passed easily. She returned home that evening with quiet joy, placing the new documents beside her old ledger. Progress, she mused, was best measured not in laws changed, but in hearts re-educated. The winter that followed was gentle. Snow came late, dusting the city like powdered sugar. Evelyn's health remained steady, though slower now. She accepted it with grace. Her balcony plants slept beneath burlap covers, waiting for spring. She spent long evenings listening to music, sipping tea, and watching the flicker of lights on the distant river. Rosa visited often, their conversations looping between memory and philosophy. Do you ever regret fighting? Rosa asked once. Evelyn shook her head. No. Regret belongs to those who gave up first. Her eyes gleamed with humor. Besides, stubbornness is my family tradition. They laughed until tears came, and the laughter felt like a shield against all endings. One night, her son called to tell her that a documentary team wanted to feature her story in a series about community resilience. She hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea of turning her life into spectacle. But then he said softly, maybe others need to see what choice looks like. She agreed. The filmmakers were kind, unobtrusive, and when the piece aired, Evelyn's story resonated far beyond the city. Messages arrived from across the country, even from abroad. People thanked her for reminding them that humanity's strength lies not in youth or innovation, but in the endurance of conscience. She smiled, humbled, knowing she had become a small symbol of something she never intended. The simple defiance of living truthfully. As spring approached once more, the mayor sent a formal letter of commendation, delivered by hand. Evelyn placed it beside her framed copy of Ms. Grant's note, her ledger now full to its last page. When Rosa came to visit that afternoon, they sat together by the window watching sunlight spill like gold dust across the floor. "You've changed the city, you know," Rosa said. Evelyn chuckled softly. "I just reminded it that we're still here." She lifted her tea, savoring the steam, and added, "It's funny, isn't it? All this because of one sentence spoken without thought." Rosa smiled. He really had no idea. Evelyn's laughter filled the room, gentle, victorious, endless. The morning sunlight spilled across Evelyn's table with the same measured gentleness it always had, but today it carried the pale chill of early spring, a kind of fragile brightness that made everything seem briefly immortal. She sat at the table in her cardigan and slippers, her fingers curled around a cup of tea gone lukewarm, her eyes scanning the quiet hum of her apartment. The walls were dressed with the trophies of an unintentional legacy, letters from city officials, framed photos from the advisory board, a clipping of the article that had once called her the voice of the quiet rebellion. The air smelled faintly of chamomile and the first rain. She had slept lightly, half dreaming of the past, of kitchens filled with laughter, of her son, as a boy, building towers of blocks on this same floor, of mornings when her husband's footsteps still marked the rhythm of domestic life. The memories no longer stung. They had softened into companions that sat silently at the edge of her waking world. She took a deep breath and smiled to herself, aware that the season was changing not only outside her window but within her bones too. Time, she thought, was doing what it always promised, finishing its work with mercy. Her son was due to visit that afternoon, bringing her grandchildren who had been clamoring for one of her lemon cakes. She had baked the batter already, its sweet scent lingering in the air, and she glanced at the clock to time the oven's preheat. Her movements were slower now, deliberate but unhurried, each step a practiced agreement between will and age. On the shelf above the counter sat her ledger, its spine swollen with use, pages crowded with notes, clippings, and dates. It was no longer just her defense, it had become a chronicle of a movement, a record of human stubbornness wrapped in grace. She had meant to pass it to her son eventually, though not yet. Some part of her still loved the idea of one more spring with it near her hand. As she poured the cake mixture into its pan, she heard the faint buzz of her intercom. Rosa's voice crackled through. "Open up, I've got tulips." Evelyn laughed and pressed the door release. Within minutes, Rosa entered, her cheeks flushed from wind, arms full of flowers wrapped in paper that smelled of damp soil and hope. They arranged them together in a glass vase, chatting about trivial things: the mayor's new campaign, Marcus's latest project, a neighbor's cat that had learned to open drawers. The ease between them had become a rhythm as familiar as breath. When Evelyn's son arrived with his children, the apartment filled with the chaos of family life. The youngest ran to her immediately, demanding stories, while the eldest helped set plates on the table. The cake came out golden, the room perfumed with sugar and lemon. They ate, laughed, and shared news. Her son watched her closely at times, a mix of pride and quiet concern in his eyes. He noticed how her hands trembled slightly when she poured tea, how she sometimes paused mid-sentence to gather a thought, how she seemed both utterly herself and somehow distant, as if part of her lived already in a softer world. When the children left to play in the hallway, he stayed behind to help with dishes. "You've been tired lately," he said gently. Evelyn smiled, drying her hands on a towel. "Tired is another word for well-lived," she said. "Don't confuse rest with decline." He nodded, touched by the calm in her tone. Still, when he left that evening, his goodbye lingered a second longer than usual. She stood at the window after they were gone, watching their figures vanish down the street, the city lights blinking on one by one. She felt a quiet gratitude swell inside her, deep and warm, the kind that asks for nothing more than acknowledgement. The following weeks passed in a soft rhythm. Her duties with the advisory board grew lighter, delegated to younger members she had trained. The Living Choice Network continued to thrive without her constant guidance, led now by Rosa and Marcus, their energy carrying the flame forward. Evelyn spent her mornings reading and her afternoons writing letters, sometimes to strangers who had written her after the documentary aired. Her correspondence was full of warmth and wisdom, small paragraphs that reminded people to defend gently but persist. She never used grand words. She believed truth spoke best in human tones. The city seemed to shift with her new accessibility programs, community outreach centers, younger volunteers visiting the elderly not out of obligation but curiosity. It was as if the quiet revolution she began had folded itself into the culture, like yeast in dough. Sometimes she marveled at how something so small as stubborn refusal to leave one's home could ripple into so many hearts. Humanity, she realized, did not advance through grand gestures but through the accumulation of ordinary decencies. One rainy afternoon, she felt a heaviness in her chest that made her sit down sooner than planned. It wasn't fear, just awareness. Her breath came shorter, and she rested her hand on the table to steady herself. Outside, thunder murmured faintly. The tulips Rosa had brought last week drooped but still glowed in the dim light. She thought briefly of calling someone but decided against it. The house was peaceful. The air carried the scent of rain and old wood, and she felt surrounded by the quiet chorus of everything she had built. She closed her eyes and let her mind drift, not backward but inward, to that deep stillness where life gathers its own meaning. She remembered her son's words from years ago, the threat that had unknowingly set her course. "I'll ensure you're in that nursing home, one way or another," he'd said. But it was she who had ensured something far greater, that no one else would be sent anywhere against their will again without being heard. The irony made her smile faintly. She whispered, "You had no idea, my love, no idea at all." The rain fell harder then, soft percussion on the window, and the sound folded around her like a lullaby. When Rosa arrived later that day, she found Evelyn seated at the table, her expression peaceful, her tea untouched, her hand resting beside her ledger. There was no distress, no struggle, just stillness, as if she had drifted gently from one room to another. Rosa stood silently for a moment, tears rising but tempered by awe. She called Marcus, then her son, who came rushing through the rain, his face pale with grief. He knelt beside his mother, holding her hand, feeling both the ache of loss and the strange lightness of knowing she had left exactly as she had lived on her own terms. On the table beside her lay a sealed envelope with his name written in her careful script. Inside was a short note. "My dear boy, when I leave, remember that care is not control. Love listens. Promise me you'll teach this. With all my He read it twice, the tears finally spilling down his face, and he whispered, "I will." The days that followed were filled with tributes. The city council held a moment of silence in her honor, and the community hall where she had first spoken was renamed the Evelyn Harrow Center for Living Choice. The plaque Rosa had once given her was mounted at the entrance, its words etched deeper now, for speaking when silence was easier. Her son delivered a eulogy at the gathering, his voice breaking only once. "My mother taught me that dignity is not a privilege," he said. "It's a right that must be guarded with kindness. I once thought safety meant control. She showed me it means trust." The crowd, neighbors, officials, strangers stood quietly, their grief mingling with gratitude. Rosa placed tulips on the podium afterward, whispering, "Rest easy, my stubborn friend." In the months that followed, Evelyn's influence continued to ripple. The city implemented new guidelines for elder autonomy named after her, ensuring that every assessment required the individual's presence, consent, and representative of choice. Her story spread through civic networks and classrooms, taught as an example of how one voice, spoken calmly and clearly, could recalibrate an entire system. Her son kept her apartment for a time, unable to let go of its warmth, but eventually, he transformed it into a community reading room for seniors, a place filled with sunlight, tea, and quiet conversation. On the wall near the window hung a framed copy of her letter, beside a small photograph of her watering her balcony garden, face turned toward the light. People said the room carried her spirit still. Sometimes, when the afternoon breeze lifted the curtains just right, it felt like she had simply stepped into another room to fetch more tea. Years later, her grandson, now an adult, visited the center for a school project. He walked through the rooms, reading plaques and letters, until he came to the display that held her old ledger, preserved under glass. He leaned close, tracing the neat, deliberate handwriting through the reflection. At the bottom of one page, written in fading ink, he found a line he had never heard before. "If the world ever forgets how to listen, remind it with patience." He smiled, understanding for the first time what his father had meant when he spoke of her strength. Standing by the window, looking out over the same street she once watched, he whispered softly, "You had no idea either, Grandma, but now we do." Outside, the city pulsed with the same restless kindness Evelyn had once helped revive. The buildings stood a little taller in the sunlight, the parks a little fuller with laughter, the care centers quieter, because more people were now home, living by choice. and in the gentle rustle of spring wind moving through the tulips planted by the community hall. It seemed the city itself was whispering her lesson back into the world. That humanity's truest strength is not in progress or policy, but in the simple, stubborn act of seeing one another fully and listening.